And now, from beyond our dimension, this is the JeffMara podcast. Here's Jeff.
My guest is Dr. Kathy Winings, who had a life-changing near-death experience after suffering a ruptured cerebral aneurysm. Dr. Winings, thank you for joining me and welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
Doc, if you don't mind, let's start on the day you died and go there.
Okay. Well, I'll lead up a little bit to that because that was also interesting for me.
Okay.
I'm sitting at home. It's December 5th, and that date is very important to me. At 5 o'clock in the evening, I just saw a document, something on TV, getting ready to practice the piano. Went in to get a glass of water, and there's this rushing of water in your ears, like you've been swimming and you got swimmer's ear. And I said, well, maybe I got up too soon from my seat. So I went back to the living room. No headache, no nothing at all. And it didn't get better. And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, maybe I'll drive over to the ER. It's only 5 minutes away. When a woman's voice was very clear, it said, no, you won't do that. When you had your heart attack, you said you wouldn't do that ever again. But more importantly, you won't make it out your driveway. So get off your duff and call EMS immediately. So I did. And the first thing I said to the poor man, I said, I live alone. I don't want to die alone. And I have no idea why I said that. But he said, don't worry. Ambulance came. From the moment the ambulance got there, he had me unlock the door. And after that, I was out for 2 months. And I learned later that that voice was my mother. My mother had died December 5th at about 5:30 in the evening in 1985 of a massive cerebral aneurysm in the same location as mine. I'm sitting there going, wow, because I wanted to know what voice this was that I heard. Was it just an angel, my guardian angel? No, I believed firmly it's my mother. But for the next, they got me down to the location, the hospital that has it's a level 2 trauma center here in Poughkeepsie called Vassar Brothers. And they just put in a brand new neurosurgical unit, the only one in the whole region. And it's a Saturday night, and they were able to get a neurosurgeon there from White Plains, which is about an hour and a half away. Got him there within the 5-hour time window. That is usually pretty critical with most brain aneurysms. You don't get that kind of with a heart aneurysm, unfortunately, but you do have that lag for a brain. And evidently, I had the first stroke in the ER here up where I live. And then as I was coming out of that, I guess the nurses told me I was a little weird, because I said to the nurse, my husband just got off work. He's in Long Island. He'll be here shortly. And they knew I wasn't married, that I was divorced. They said, this is interesting. So when they called my contact person, they said, has Kathy remarried recently? And my friend said, jokingly, not unless she eloped in the last 5 days. But then my friend said, why are you calling? And they said, more importantly, we need to know, does she have a DNR order? We're not sure she'll make it through the evening. So fortunately, they got me down to the other hospital. And for the next month, it was in and out, in and out, in and out, and another stroke. And more funny things. I asked a nurse one time, why do you have an American accent? And she's saying, well, honey, where do you think we are? I said, England, of course. And it seems that throughout that month, I sort of relived places I lived. I was in a band that went to Europe for England for a year, to the British Isles, things like that. And so I told my chaplain, it was during COVID, so the only one who could see me was my chaplain, who was a former student. And I said in one of my fogs, have you seen the dishy doctors? which she's never let me forget because it's not the way I talk or think. So all these kind of things. But finally, by the end of December after Christmas, I had stabilized enough that they decided to send me back up to the original hospital to do two weeks at least of residential rehab. They were driving up in the ambulance, and just as we hit Rhinebeck, we're about maybe 10 minutes away from the hospital. I crashed pretty hard. And by the time they got me here, they weren't sure what I was doing, what would happen. And they worked pretty frantically for about an hour and a half. But in that time, I was in somewhere else. I thought I'd heard them say, we're going to use the interreligious entrance for the emergency room because I work in a seminary and I'm used to doing interreligious dynamics and working with diverse faith communities. So I'm sitting there, oh, that's cool. I didn't know Northern Duchess had two ER entrances, and one is for interfaith. Oh, that's wonderful. And next thing I know, oh, you're going to be on the dairy farm. I'm sitting there thinking, I didn't know Northern Duchess had a dairy farm. Really? A dairy farm? Really? Oh, that's cool. And next thing you know, I'm on a dairy farm. And that was my crossover. I saw it as a place that for me was calming, which is a farm. Both my parents had been farmers as children. But I tell you, it was unlike any farm I've ever seen. The barn for the dairy, for the cows, was the most brilliant, shimmering red I have ever seen. I've never seen something that red since. It shimmered. And it was a stunning red. I see it in my mind all the time. It was that red. It lived and breathed kind of thing. And the silver of the equipment, of the dairy equipment, gleamed. Of course, I never saw a cow. I never saw a worker. I didn't smell anything. So I thought, this is interesting. Then I'm ushered into the kitchen, the farm kitchen, for a snack. And I'm looking at the table. I'm going, wow, feel the wood grain. Wow, this is stunning wood. Have you ever seen a piece of wood like this? Wow, I'm just tripping out on these little things. And I remember asking, is there a restroom around? I heard saying, yes, on the second floor, but you have to walk up. There's no elevator. I'm thinking, this is an intriguing way to do physical therapy. Wow, you make them walk up the stairs. And I thought, what if you can't walk up the stairs? These things are going through my head. Meanwhile, the ER is trying to keep me alive. And next thing I know, I'm taking a walk outside on the farm. And again, the grass was shimmering green, shimmering green. The sky was the kind of blue that in the movie Oklahoma, you say Oklahoma, where and you talk about these brilliant blue skies in these songs. That's what it was like. And I felt that I was on my way. I was going to be going over a hill. Somehow I knew I was going to be meeting Jesus, Muhammad, and a pastor that was my senior pastor who had died. It didn't dawn on me that if that's going to take place, I must be somewhere I'm surprised at. I must be on the other side. But it didn't cross my mind at all. I'm walking and I'm walking and I'm coming up over a rise and I see the tops of three heads. Then a voice behind me says, no, 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 no. It's not your time. You need to go back. You still have work to do for me. And then next thing I know, I'm in this kind of eerie kind of space, sort of like a hospital room, but yet not. It was an odd experience. It was like in a different spiritual reality. And that's the last thing I experienced for another month. They sent me back to the original hospital. That was my third stroke. So during that time and that next month is when I had a series of conversations with God. I just knew instinctively that's who it was. And beyond that, actually, I was I was introduced to Mother God, to the feminine aspect of God, in which God said to me, "You do realize that I saved you. I saved you. It wasn't your theology. It wasn't your doctrine. It wasn't words that saved you. I saved you through my love." And I was asked to put my hand on my arm to feel the blood that's flowing through your veins. Feel that. That is how real my love is. It flows in your veins as strongly as your blood flows. And I want you to remember that. That began a series of conversations that I had spiritually with what I call Mother God, the feminine aspect of God, in which finally, once I was a little bit more conscious and was sent back up to do rehab, those conversations continued. So that point of the combination of the experience in the spiritual realm when I crossed over briefly and the conversations that came after that when I was unconscious and semi-conscious began what I call my near-death experience. And it taught me, and I've learned from that time, that it's not a one-time static experience. For me, at least, it wasn't. It's an ongoing dynamic relationship. And I was able to put together through these conversations that the reason the colors, on the farm gleamed and sort of vibrated with life was because it was the part of the realm of the spiritual realm where God lives, which you might call the realm of the original design, the creative realm, where God hasn't created everything yet, but is thinking about it. That's why I was told that's why it shimmered and the colors were so vivid. And my experience and feeling of God and God's love was so visceral. But more importantly for me, if I want to talk about my takeaway, really, the real draw of my near-death experience was what I learned. First thing after God talked to me about how God's love saved me, he said, "Now I expect things from you. And here's how I want you to live according to that love. First, I want you to seek forgiveness from people, people who you think your words or actions may have harmed their hearts." And that was a very clear statement that you may have said or done something that they perceived as having hurt them and hurt their heart, their feelings. And it goes beyond just feelings. So that was the first thing I had to do. And it was not easy, the first few people, especially the first one. I really felt I had to sort of really gear up and sort of like eating crow kind of thing, where you really say, I want to apologize and ask your forgiveness. It's gotten easier and less frequent, less need for it. But I will say this, that first person has become a dear friend. And about a month or two afterwards, this person rang me up and said, "Hey, my family's away and visiting. I want to see this film, but I don't want to go alone. You want to go with me?" He would never have done that. Never. And I was like, I almost fell out of my chair. I was like, well, okay, sure. All right. The other thing, the second comment that God made after that was how I look at things will shift, especially how I will review papers. I was an academic. I did a lot of editing of papers. I was on an editorial board for a journal and also for several journals, as well as for a blog. So I'm sitting there. He said, You will not look at it the same. So don't be surprised if you can't relate to them anymore. Sure enough, one of the early papers that I was asked to review with the board, I read it and it sort of like it went boom, right over my head. I said, I can't relate to it at all. I don't feel the depth of heart in it that fuels its cognitive contribution. And I wrote to as we were talking with the other editors, I said, I can't relate to this article in this way. And I said, I think your comments are brilliant, but I can't relate to the article. And they asked me why. And I said, I'm missing a sense of heart and love and emotion that fuels what they're trying to say intellectually. It's dry. It's 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 like no blood in it, no heart. And that has become a constant now of mine. I'm editing a book now for someone, and Mike, I realize now why I've been asked to edit it is because he's very cognitive, very cognitive. I'm now not running with my cognition first, which I used to do. I took pride in that as an educator. I had a good intellect. I had an incredible memory, eidetic memory. And now I couldn't do that. I could take apart a paper like nobody's business until my NDE. After my near death experience, no, I can't do that anymore. And how I teach piano has shifted also. I don't teach piano to my students in a cognitive manner. I don't lead the piano lesson about technique first. I lead them to ask them, find the heart behind this piece for you. How does this piece fuel your heart? How does it touch this? Let that flow through your fingertips and then the skill will come, the technique will come. But if you go with technique first and lead with that, there'll be little heart in it. And this is how it's impacted what I do, how that simple shift of not being able to relate to things that are not, said in that way. The second shift that has been very dramatic for me is becoming aware of my language and how I talk and think about people. Again, as an academic and a person I'm an Aries woman, so I'm very strong minded. I used to be strong minded. And I would be very critical about people, about their thoughts. And I could engage in political conversations with the best of them. Or I could have repartee with someone. I could have comebacks like, whoa, really? I can't do that anymore because I realized and I learned what we say, the language we use with people, even just in our thoughts, is harming. It harms them physically as well as emotionally, spiritually, and it harms us. It comes right back. And this has been fueled also by a subsequent article that one of my former students wrote on this concept of words and the damage they do. If you've seen any of that out of Japan, it came back to my mind. I realized, wow, if this is what negative language can do, they had water crystals in a glass, clear glass, and they put on one glass terrible words like "I hate you," "You're ugly," "You're terrible," "No one likes you," and the other glass was "You're beautiful," and those kind of words. And when they took pictures of the crystals, the ones with the negative words, the crystals looked like sludge, mud, horribly dirty. Whereas the other jar were the most beautiful crystal structures one has ever seen of water crystals. And this is one thing that, God spoke to me and said, this is the damage you do when you talk about people in a negative way, when you say it to their face or even put it out in the air and criticize them in that way. And it comes back to you, especially if our bodies are three-quarters water. Is an interesting thought. So it changed during this political season. It changed what I said about people. And I would say, well, wouldn't it be better to one, pray for this person, but also let's talk about their policies. No need to slam the person. You talk about, well, I don't agree with the view on poverty or the economy or women or this. I can do that without saying that person is horribly stupid. And the mudslinging that we saw this year, I thought was outrageous. Outrageous. And I wrote letters to the political parties about that because I felt God pushing me. We've got to change our language, our attitude, how we think about people. Even in the smallest areas, it has changed me. The impact of my NDE is driving down the road, someone does something not too smart, like cut you off. Before my NDE, I probably would have said, dirty freak, something like that to be polite. I was never allowed to swear at home, but I don't do that. My first thought now is instinctively, I hope they can improve their driving skills so that they don't harm themselves or others. That's a big change for me, big change. So that was another way of changing my language. My NDE, my near death experience, also has changed my concept of God in that way. And it has made me more sensitive to listen to God and to hear how God is speaking or not to me. And how do I comfort the heart of God? That when I do these crazy, dumb things, these things that harm others and harm myself, it hurts the heart of God. I am God's daughter. God loves all of us. I don't care the most evil person is loved by God. They just don't feel it. They're not recognizing it. They're not aware of it. So I comfort God through how I view people. So my near death experience has really, if I'm not the same person, I have to say, I assumed also before my experience that we have an original mind, an original heart. That's the language I was taught to use when I went through school. And I thought that our conscience, was a little bit came out of that cognitive view. If I have a good mind, I have a clear mind. It's not filled with junk, things like that. But I didn't really understand a more profound view of our conscience and what that original mind really means. After the NDE, in a conversation with God, had talked about this and looked at God reminded me of the dynamic. What comes first? Your intellect or your heart? What fuels and drives your thinking or should drive your thinking and your conscience? Is it your intellect or should it be your ability to think with the deeper emotion and strive to understand the heart of God? Religion talks about the heart of God, but have we really understood it? Through the NDE, from that very first moment when God said, I saved you through my love, and feel that love, that changed the dynamic of love for me. And then I began looking at, oh, how is my conscience shaped? It is not intellectual, that it comes first from my heart through that love, that deeper understanding, and fuels my thoughts, my cognition, my intellect. So it's one thing for me, I've also learned then, it's one thing for me to talk about being transformed by my NDE, and many of us do. At the near death conference, every year we talk about, oh, I was transformed. The theme this year in Phoenix at the conference was, how were we transformed by our NDE? Last year it was what did we learn about love? This year was how were we transformed? And I had to really think, how was I transformed? It's nice to say, oh, I had a jazzy, ride in the spiritual existence, with some angel and on the wings of an angel. All right, that's good for a moment or two. But what's the power of that experience? You crossed over. And if I think about it, I crossed over and came back. And through that experience, if I can't let that shape me and transform me, boy, have I wasted that experience and God's energy. Why did God bother? I had to be different as a result. So transformation I've become a more reflective person. I think more about what I say and I think with my heart. As I mentioned before, how I teach piano is different. How I respond on Facebook is different. Friends of mine, or let me say acquaintances, were talking about how they could not support the the U.S. soccer team, women's soccer team, because of the presence of women who were gay, and how terrible that is. And now I could have slammed them. I could have said many things, but what I was led to say is, what would it be like if we genuinely loved people? What if we loved them so that they find their true self, whatever that may be? Who are we to determine what that true self is? That is between them and God. But to get to that point, they need to feel loved. What if we loved people and prayed that they are able to find their true selves and their love and who they are? Person wrote back, well, it sounds great, but I can't support evil. And my response was, since Quinn is loving and praying for someone evil, and that also allowed me to love my own niece who came out to me finally. And she said, do you still love me? I said, of course I love you. You know, you were loved by God. How can I do any less? How can I do less? So this has been the impact on me and the transformation for me from my near-death experience. And it's reminded me one thing I thought about after all is said and done. We look forward to the time in which the power of love replaces the love of power. You know, that's a Gladstone comment. And that really reflects the world that I see as a result of my NDE. So I hope I can only continue to be transformed by this. That's my story.
Kathy, thanks for sharing your story with us. You called the realm on the other side the realm of the original design, basically. If that's true, do you think where we live here is a copy?
Yes, that's an interesting way to put it, but I would think it is. It's meant to be a reflection. I believe that that original design is so far different from what we actually have. And until we make that connection and realize that what powers things and what even powers the image of God is that love. I mean, one of the images I had subsequently was being able to see the nature of God being fueled by that love in the very core. That's the original design out of which we were created. So, yes, this world was meant to reflect that in order to bring joy to God. God is a parent. You have children. You hope that they reflect the best in you, right? That's in a sense what I learned from this and experienced from this is that's the original design. So yes, this should be the best copy, but because we don't recognize that design fully, it's not a good copy always. Let me put it that way.
Being there and experiencing it, would you say it's dreamlike or more real than being here?
That's a good question, but I would have to say it was more real. At least when I'm looking at the bar, I was looking at the barn or the sky, the birds, the wood table. It was like, wow, nobody's business. I, I'm still looking for that kind of color and experience. So, yeah, to me, it was not dreamlike for me. It was real. And when I walked that path, I felt the crunch of the gravel under my feet. It was real.
Do you think God presented herself in a feminine form to you because that would be more acceptable for you to relate?
That's a great question, Jeff. I've No one's asked me that question. That's a great question. Um, I would say maybe more yes than no. And I'd qualify it by saying, I think God wants us to experience the fullness of God. And religion talks so much about God, He. And then so on the flip side, you have the more feminist theology that talks about God, she. And I don't think it's either or. It's both. So maybe I think yes, maybe it was a two-edged thing because I could relate and because my heavenly parent wanted me to see that dimension and that I could receive that sense of understanding the flow of love in my veins easier from coming from a feminine aspect of God. But it's a great question.
Hmm, thank you. Have you noticed that you have any new abilities since your experience that could be considered psychic?
Yeah, I do. Funny you should ask. Not immediately. Not immediately. I've always been, I would call myself a sensitive person. Um, but definitely I would say, especially in the last year and a half, I have become a lot more mediumistic in that sense. So for example, I've been reading a book on Dolly Madison and called it Perfect Union. And then I felt her spirit talking to me. But then another spirit came in, which was a former slave of her husband's, and that she inherited on his death. And the anger and resentment that he felt because she, one, didn't free him, and being enslaved was not the ideal, and that he was treated like a commodity. And with another medium, we facilitated a discussion between the two of them. His name was Paul Jennings. And she sold him eventually to Daniel Webster. And Daniel finally freed him. And he became a big abolitionist in Washington, D.C., Paul did. Um, but it was able to bring the two of them together in dialogue. So I would not have thought about being able to do that before. I'd not been sensitive enough. So yeah, I do. And when I'm playing piano, if I'm really in the groove of that number, that piece, I hear humming behind me. I have also continued to experience my mother. After I had a heart aneurysm that I had open heart surgery a year ago. My mother was here afterwards, and I could feel her going like this, like putting a blanket over me, making sure I was warm when I fell asleep in the chair, to the point where I woke up and said, "Mom," although I know she's gone. So, yes, I would say that has opened me up a lot more.
Has piano playing become spiritual for you now? Like you get lost in the music and become it?
Well, I've always had a thing about music, always. Um, I'm not sure I would go so far as to say I've become lost in it. Again, that's another interesting question, Jeff. I'm going to have to read it. I'm going to be thinking about that one for a while. Um, I will say this, there have been certain pieces, especially during Christmas time. I love Christmas music. I go gaga over Christmas music. Um, there are certain pieces that just resonate in my soul more deeply. Maybe that's closer to what your question. I mean, I've never thought it in the way you've expressed the question, but yeah, there are times there's certain pieces, um, simple pieces. Edward McDowell, an American composer in the early 1900s, had a beautiful piece of music called "To a Wild Rose." Really simple, but sometimes simple piano pieces are the more difficult. But when I play it now, it sings. So maybe if that, I would say yes, maybe, yeah, in that sense, yes.
Do you fear death?
No, I don't. Now, I will, to be honest though, before then, before my NDE, I'm not sure I would say I was afraid of death. Being a person who taught in a seminary and taught religious education and did ministry, I didn't necessarily have a fear of death itself. I was conscious of not um, going before I finished what I should do or wanted to do or was able to do. Maybe it's a combination of that. Um, but afterwards, no, I don't have a fear. Um, I'm loved. And if I'm loved here, I'm going to be loved there. You know, it's just I'm a little bit more driven now to make sure I respond well to why, my heavenly parents saved me. There's work to do, whatever I can do, fine. And if they decide, if I'm, it's decided I'm more needed there, then okay, so be it. It's a transition to me. It's a passage.
Have you discovered what you're supposed to be doing here?
Yes, I think so. I think so. One is to share some of these realizations about um, what I've talked about this afternoon in terms of how we treat each other, how we speak to each other, the value of grounding our consciousness in our life, in our hearts, in that sense. Not to say that we all become mushy kind of heart. That I mean something that's deeper, more profound, that guides our thinking, and that we are loved. We are loved, and that the reason why we see so much pain is because their love is not being felt or experienced. Um, I listen to, the crime that we see, the shootings. We think, oh my gosh, it's increased. I have to go back to wonder, was that person ever, did they ever come into contact with love? And so I feel that I'm supposed to share that and to change our language and to share it also with the next generation, that there is more. And it's not, one doesn't have to be religious to believe this or to do this. I personally believe religion will fade away, that the purpose of religion is to connect us to God. Once we experience that original design, we're there, you know? So I think that's my purpose.
If you had a friend that was suffering due to the loss of a loved one, what type of advice would you give?
One, I would say that that loved one will continue to love you. You can receive their love, even though they're on the other side. And secondly, that, that experience of loss is something that God has experienced over and over again. Every time we have someone who has committed great atrocities, God suffers. When we see a child, a baby with cancer, God suffers in his heart, in her heart. There's a sense of sadness, sadness. Said, you have experienced that with God. How do you take that understanding now and share love with someone else who doesn't feel it, who doesn't have the benefit of that? Can you do that? Is it possible to honor your loved one in that way? That would be the advice, you know, I would hear, I would hope I would give at that point. Um, I know that there is an incredible video out there that at the IANS conference in Washington was premiered. They interviewed 5 directors, hospice care directors, about what they learned about death. And they created this video for the loved ones to learn how to let them go, that their loved ones are being guided to let go from the other side, and that their loved ones here need to realize it's just a passage. And they can continue to love them, but they need to let them go where they need to go. There was not a dry eye on the house, by the way, when we saw that one. All 250 of us were sitting there bawling our eyes out. It was an incredible film, but that's what I hope we learn, to not fear death, and love is eternal. It doesn't stop at the door.
Kathy, after watching this podcast, people may want to reach out to you and ask you questions. Are you open to that?
Oh, absolutely.
What's the best way to contact you?
Best way would be through my email. And my email is Dr. Kathy Winings, DrKathyWinings@gmail.
Before we finish up, Can you leave us with one last positive message?
Very simply, we are loved and we're capable of great love.
Kathy, thank you for your message, and thank you for being my guest.
Thank you for inviting me, Jeffrey. I enjoyed this very much. I loved your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for watching the JeffMara podcast. I really appreciate you. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. And if you do, there are loyalty badges and other perks depending on your level of membership. All you need to do is click the join button underneath the video to find out more. Thank you for your support.